as this past Sunday was Yom Yerushalayim, this entire week has been devoted to different activities and siyurim, tiyulim, little, how do you translate tiyul? Little trips in Jerusalem. And some of you, no doubt, are familiar with Moshava HaGermanit, the German colony. Yep. Probably the most famous street is Emek Rephaim. And interestingly enough, I, until Monday, never at all was curious where the German colony got its name. Is anybody aware of where that name comes from? But I hadn't even been curious about it, and that bothers me. However, a friend of mine, both of us not thinking really sanely, came in from Rehovot suggesting that we go on one of these tiyulim that was going to go around this neighborhood, Moshava Germanit, the German colony, with a guide. And why did I say we didn't do this sanely? Because it was at 12 noon in the heat of the day, but to redeem ourselves. The few days before that had actually been cooler than usual. Anyway, so we start on this tiyul, and the guide is stopping at different buildings, which might now be residences, that have these little blue signs, and it gives a history of the home and the person who built it, and very interesting little anecdotes. And it turned out that a key theme of the tour, which was an hour and a half, was the German Templar colony. Now, does anybody know what that means, Templar? I did not know. Never.
They were Christians who came and, part of the Knights Templar that tried to take over Jerusalem in the 1200s.
Right, they were the Crusaders.
Yes. Leave it to Bev, who was much more than a librarian, but a resource person, to know about everything. Well, I did not. And in the second half, as she said, of the 19th century, they came from Germany, these Christians, almost on a messianic mission, hoping that if they were in Palestine, they would perhaps hurry the arrival, the second coming of Christ. And so they built up about 7 communities across Palestine. And it was only in about 1939, when they started associating with the Nazis, that they were exiled. And many of them were sent to Australia. So that was very interesting. The truth is, actually, I often, when I see a street, wonder or say I should look up, because every street here has some historical meaning. Do you know what Young Street is named after? I didn't know this till I moved away. You should all look it up. I think it was a commander or a general or something. Young Street in Toronto. Look it up. Okay. Now,
it's also the longest street in the world that goes all the way to Fort Francis or something.
Yes, this is true too. Anyway, now we are anticipating Shavuot. And today I saw what I assumed was a class. They looked like they were either first graders, second graders, walking with 2 teachers, and they were carrying baskets with wheat in the baskets and some fruit and decorations. And I don't know if they were walking to decorate a Beit Knesset, but I have to tell you, what struck me was that the teachers were smiling. Now, you might find that odd. Why did I notice that teachers, and especially teachers of children so young, were smiling? because on Monday, this past Monday, there was a demonstration in Tel Aviv of many, many teachers, schools shut down at 1 o'clock, who are fighting for an increase in their salaries. That's a universal issue, but I gotta tell you, it hurts, particularly in Israel, Am HaSefer, the people of the book, that teachers aren't recognized in the way that they should. Now, that's not to say that there are some teachers who are not deserving, but when I meet or hear of a few teachers in the last while in Jerusalem having left the teaching position because it just wasn't paying, and these were wonderful teachers, it hurts. It hurts. Now, I've been following some comments that it shouldn't just be the teachers. And people, 3 of these comments were put in the context of Chag Shavuot. It shouldn't just be teachers who are demonstrating, but who should it be?
Parents.
Parents. Unless we are going to fully get behind this notion of education being essential, the right kind of education, then we're failing in part of our job vis-a-vis our children. Okay, so,
Bracha,
yes.
you talked about history before. There is one place that I don't understand why tourist guides don't take them. In the time of the Romans, when you're not allowed to gather together, there is I don't know if it's Sanhedria or Tel Arza, out of a big rock, there is a Knesset. And when you go down, you have to almost crawl, and it's a room inside a room inside a room. It's fascinating. And for somehow it's not very well known. And I remember when I took my husband to see it, and he was amazed. He said, but Esther, it's not on either of the guiding tours. I said, I don't understand why. So I thought you might be interested in seeing it.
Okay. I won't go at 12 in noon, but okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's a
So,
big rock, and you actually have to crawl from room to room.
okay. So why do we read Megillat Ruth on Shavuot? To say because Ruth is giving us a picture of agriculture and it's harvest time. It's too simplistic an answer as we conclude this part of this series about laws and laws that are divine. We're going to focus on 2 proposed reasons that actually reinforce, I must say, 2 concepts that I have repeatedly shared with you, not just over this series, but over the years. 1, our traditions call for human beings taking initiative while partnering with God. There are 2 parts to that one. Taking initiative while partnering with God. Second, our traditions call for giving equal importance to mitzvot ben adam lamakom, commandments between God and people, and equally important are mitzvot between people and people. And we will remember, even if you don't remember what you did last week, you'll remember for sure from our class that I pointed out, also not for the first time, that many commandments, specific commandments, the pasuk concludes with the words v'asita hayashar v'hatov. After a specific instruction, the Torah chooses to add on, do the right thing. And we discussed that we're thinking beyond a detail of a law, but looking for the bigger picture. And if this isn't the time of year when we're celebrating Torah that we think about these two issues, there isn't a better time.
But Bracha,
So we're going to, yes?
sometimes in spite of halacha, you have to do the right thing. Because halacha is not always, like you can be halachically right and morally wrong.
Well, we discussed that. Yes, and that's what we tried to show, that
So-
even if modern day rabbis haven't seen fit to do that, that Talmudic rabbis, long time ago, did really try. And that's what our focus was last week.
Sorry, I missed that class.
That's right. Where were you? I remember you weren't there. Okay. You can look at the video. Okay. We begin with two moments experienced during Ma'amad Har Sinai, the revelation. And it came to pass on the third day when it was morning that there were thunderclaps and lightning flashes, and a thick cloud was upon the mountain, and a very powerful blast of a shofar, and the entire nation that was in the camp shuddered. Moses brought the people out toward God from the camp, and they stood at the bottom of the mountain. What do we imagine Bnei Israel, the Israelites, are feeling at this moment?
Terrified.
Terrified
and in awe.
And in awe, which are two different things. Anybody else?
Curious.
Curious. Yep. Okay. Interesting. Terrified. Curious is the most positive of the three words that have just been used. Would anybody think perhaps relieved that they're being given this gift? Interesting, nobody said that. Okay, now let's add to that text number 2. And he took the book of the covenant, Habrit, and read it within the hearing of the people, and they said, Na'aseh v'nishma, all that the Lord spoke, we will do, and we will hear. What do those last words say to you? How do you take to them that the Bnei Israel say, we will do, and then we will hear? Now, some people translate Nishma not just as hearing, but as we will understand.
But it's an unconditional acceptance.
Okay, so I'm asking you people what you think of that. The
Unconditional acceptance may lead to greater insights, on a higher level.
Okay, there are some
action followed by insights up to deeper meanings of the action.
Okay, we know that very often, once you start doing something, you do come to better understand it. So that
I also think that being willing to do something before you actually understand it shows a great deal of trust in the person who is asking you to do it. And it's also, I mean, that Na'aseh v'nishma is the beginning of Mishpatim, when all of those laws are pointed out. And it starts off with Na'aseh v'nishma.
Okay, good. So what Marlene just said is that perhaps faith was reflected in the fact that they were willing to say we're going to do, and then nishma. Now, that's interesting, because soon, what are they going to do? They're going to slide down from faith and bring out that calf, which is interesting. So keep in mind what we've just suggested, the different emotions. And I want to go back in text 1 to Pasuk Yud Zayin, verse 17. Moshe brought the people out toward God from the camp, and they stood at the bottom of the mountain. Now in the Hebrew, Vayityatzvu b'tachtit hahar. Now some of you will recognize the shoresh, the root of tachtit is tachat. Now, it can mean, and we know that Bnei Yisrael were ordered to not come right up to the mountain, but had to keep a bit of a distance. So one image we have is seeing a mountain. Look up pictures and artists, different depictions, and you'll see crowds of people standing literally at the foot of the mountain. But some have also understood bitachtit, and a midrash describes this, that Bnei Israel were standing underneath the mountain, that God lifted Har Sinai and held it over them. Now, what image, or what does that image imply?
Well, I look at the word Vayityatzvu instead of Amdu. They stood erect.
Okay, nice. Okay, for another discussion. But
No
the
choice.
image of God putting this
Yeah,
mountain
It's no
over
choice.
them,
There's a
that they
threat.
are being coerced. Exactly. That they are being coerced into this. Now, look at text number 3. They gathered at the foot of the mountain. Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa said, this teaches us that God suspended the mountain above them like a barrel and said, if you accept the Torah, good. If not, there will be your burial place. Now, just as an aside, this isn't meant to mean that God's necessarily going to punish them, to kill them, but more to say that the Torah is an imperative, necessary, if you really want to live a quality life. And if you don't follow it, that's what's naturally going to happen. So now, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says, from here emerges a great protest about the Torah. Now, what is that protest? In other words, since the people were coerced into the covenant, they are not responsible for the agreement. It means if they were forced, then what about everything that we've said up till now, that they're in a partnership as equal partners? You can't be, it's not an agreement, it's not a legitimate agreement if you haven't done this out of your own free will.
But that thought contradicts Naaseh v'Nishma.
Okay? That's what I'm trying to do here, for us to see the different ways of looking at what happened there. Rava said, nonetheless, they reaffirmed their acceptance in the days of Achashverosh in the Purim story. As it says, the Jews established and accepted. They established what they had already accepted. Now, this will sound strange to you, but you'll remember that in Megillat Esther, God is absent. And so it is suggested, because of God's absence, human beings had to assume responsibility. Now, the essence of what this text from the Talmud is saying, and why I've brought it, is this point that I have tried repeatedly to make about us having free will and for us being in this literally together with God. So if they were forced, you might say, then the Brit isn't legitimate until the time of Esther. We won't go there now. So there are two contemporary rabbis who suggest that if in fact this element from the Midrash of coercion is yes, it's only meant to be a temporary condition. Now, before we read these two texts from these two contemporary rabbis, would anybody like to suggest why, perhaps to begin with, and this is their beginning as a nation? Yes, they came out of Egypt, but now with this gift of the Torah, they are forming into a nation. Why would it perhaps be natural, and thinking of two different reasons, that Bnei Israel needed to be coerced? And perhaps it's not such a terrible thing, especially if it's only temporary. I'll repeat that because I'd like you to try to understand and answer. Offer your why. Would perhaps Bnei Israel, thinking of where they're coming from, what they've gone through, why is it possible that maybe they needed at first to be coerced as long as it was only temporary?
Well, I think that they needed leadership and order. Even the idea of the tribes and the way they camped around the whole Moed is to give them a purpose and to give them order in their life.
Okay, anybody else?
I think it was because they came with a slave mentality.
Yeah, okay,
Bracha, I think
go
there's
ahead.
I think there's an importance to the fact that it was Moses who led them to the mountain. And I think that despite everything they had, again, I'm going back to trust in Moses as a leader, and the fact that he had brought them this far, even though they had complained and said we should have stayed there and maybe we should go back. But he had brought them this far, and they were putting trust in the fact that he would not lead them into peril.
I agree, but I would add something to that. They had a need to trust him.
True.
They've gone through what they've gone through. And that's why I said a few minutes ago that perhaps they would have a sense of relief, as you'll see as we read. Yes, Marlene and Brenda, I think you both hit it. And this first text, this Rav Mois Navon, an interesting fellow. I think it's worthwhile for me to give you a couple of moments about him. His family was originally from Turkey. He grew up in LA, pretty much secular. And he had a moment where he became inspired, and he and his wife together moved some years ago, I think in the early 90s, to Israel. And he began studying. At the time when he took on religion, he was an engineer, considered brilliant in the field, but he also became a rabbi. And when he got to Israel, he became involved in Mobileye. Anybody know what Mobileye is?
Mobileye is the
Yes.
ability to put this thing on your glasses and you can read text. And also, I think it involves the aspects of car safety with being able to see the cars to the right and left of you.
Okay. Yes, and in 2017, Intel acquired Israel's Mobileye. Now, this Rabbi Navon, being now also a rabbi and somebody involved with artificial intelligence and computers, is still working for Mobileye. And what is he focusing on now? Autonomous cars.
Wow.
Wow.
I'll keep you dated because he says now other rabbis are answering questions vis-a-vis, can you use an autonomous car on Shabbat? Okay. Very interesting how he also makes a distinction between computers, because somebody was saying, as I was listening to his lecture, will there be any difference between human beings and robots? And he says, robots have a brain, but they do not think. We're not going to go on with that anyway. So this multi-talented Navon says the following. Stephen, I see your hand.
So your previous question, when people have been oppressed for 3 generations, like in
Yes.
Korea, or 12 generations, like in Mitzrayim, they don't, or the Arab Spring recently, the people don't understand what freedom is and are able to even conceive it, as witnessed by a North Korean woman who did escape. She's one of the very few, and she tells the story of, she's well known, I forget her name, of the others who have escaped from North Korea into China and have returned to the oppressive life that they had because they cannot understand what freedom is, the freedom,
Wow.
the ability to be free people. They need, that was your question,
Yeah,
your
yeah.
previous question.
Very sad, very sad. Okay, so Rabbi Navon says the following about coercion. The Midrash Tanchuma refers to the Jews in Egypt as a fetus in the womb that God delivered. They were born, as it were, upon Mount Sinai. We view the nation of Israel as an individual going through the emotional developmental stages to maturation. Their exodus from Egypt, passing through the birth canal of the Red Sea. As such, the Jews in the desert can be likened to children in respect to the relationship with God and his Torah. They were spoon-fed like babies from their Father in heaven through his daily ration of manna. At any difficulty they experienced, they simply cried and were immediately answered. When children are developing, they need definitions of appropriate behavior, boundaries of acceptable action, education of right and wrong, in short, a system of morality. If children are allowed to choose of their own free will, they will choose self-gratification. They will choose based on what looks good, feels good, tastes good. Only when one has an appreciation of oneself and the world around, something referred to as maturity, can one then begin of one's own free will to accept things that are not associated with self-gratification. Jewish law and lore acknowledge the stage development of man. So, as Brenda said, and as Stephen alluded to, they weren't ready. They weren't ready to know whether they have to think about it first, et cetera, et cetera. And there is such a thing. Now, we could spend the rest of the evening, afternoon, discussing how parents are with children these days. And if we recognize that sometimes you begin with authority and then nurture. So this is what Rabbi Navon says. Now, let's go on. An Israeli rabbi says the following, Rabbi Chagit Dotan. A people of slaves in the desert, thirsting for protection, a different master, identity, freedom, love. Of course, we were eager to accept the Torah. This is what I was referring to before as relief from God of the universe, who chose us from all peoples and sanctified us of all nations. We are his children whom he protects, and he is our Father and Master. We belong to him, for he is great and glorious, all-powerful and lofty. Is, she asks, Sinai feasible for a nation of slaves? Are those so newly liberated capable of standing at the mountain? At Sinai, we were a nation of slaves, newly released from Egypt, inferior in all aspects, meeting the true omnipotent ruler of the world in the heart of the desert from which there was no way back. Chasm between the standing of a slave and that of the all-powerful God inherently creates an enforcing situation, for the mountain is suspended over our heads. For who will not say Amen when the Almighty speaks, or even before he speaks? When we face the all-powerful, the all-controlling, do we not lose some of our own power? Chasm between us renders us unable to maintain faith and belief. If we understand thus our position at Sinai, it becomes obvious that not faith and belief, but fear and awe, hope and uncertainty made we shall do and we shall listen the logical response. When we face the boss, the commander, the one who has greater power, or the one on whom our life or our livelihood depends, do we not fulfill all of his or her demands? Slightly different takes on how they didn't necessarily choose this out of their own free will, but justified and not seen negatively for that moment. But I think both of them ultimately agree that we are meant, once we are mature, as Dotan says, to go beyond Mount Sinai and this sense of submission. You know, many people, if you were to ask, would you have wanted to be at Sinai? And people say, if only we could have Sinai today. These two people are saying, don't be so quick. You don't want to go back to that point in time because you would not have had the autonomy that a covenant calls for.
Bracha.
Both parties for a covenant need to have autonomy. And this brings us to a significant reason why we read Megillat Ruth on Shavuot. Now, I'm going to trust that all of us are familiar with the story. So I'm just quickly going to say a few things in case there is somebody that is not. And we're going to make the case that two women in this story really show us how important autonomy is. If it's not clear in the Torah, then the rabbis decided to put this Megillah together with a day that we celebrate Torah to make that point. We need the law, but we need autonomy. And so we remember there was a family in Beit Lechem, which is almost a metaphor because it means a house of food, but there was a famine. And it tells us that an ish, and whenever the word ish is used in the Tanakh, it means somebody of importance. And so there was a man, Elimelech, who was an ish, some say the mayor of the town. When this famine came, he took his family, Naomi and her two sons, Machlon and Chilion, to Moab. And they settled there, and immediately Elimelech dies, and the two sons who have already married two Moabite women, they die also. And Naomi, of course, is destroyed, but she decides that she is coming back to Beit Lechem. And we know, despite her urges for the two daughters-in-law to stay in Moab, because she's not going to be good for them anymore or give them future husbands, Orpah decides to stay. Finally, she's convinced, but Ruth, and we'll see her speech, goes with Naomi. And we get back to Beit Lechem. So let's continue now. I said that a key reason is that Megillat Ruth shows that there's a need for, in this case, it happens to be women, and maybe that's significant, to not just accept things the way they are. And if you get that feeling from the Torah and from the coerced scene at Sinai, and that obedience is the essence, no. Megillat Ruth comes along with an equally important message. And it's through Naomi and Ruth that we see how important it is to be active. So in text number 6, one proposed etymology of the word almanah, widow, derives the word from ALM, Aleph Lamed Mem, which means an elam is somebody who is unable to speak, silent, bound. Now, if we had time, I would ask you to guess, why would that be the root, not being able to speak, for a widow? And I bet you'd come up with it. So here, the man who spoke for her, for Naomi, who provided for her, who gave her a place in society, is dead. Now, some women wouldn't last long. Her new designation depicts her as a mirror of that death, mute, helpless, adrift, many of them. Small wonder that the prophets keep reminding the people to remember the widow. Along with the stranger and the orphan, she is a disconnected person, unclaimed by any and having claims upon none. For a book whose main characters are widows, Megillat Ruth, generosity is not an unpredictable theme. What is surprising is that the generosity that drives the plot originates with the characters who typify emptiness and need, the widows themselves. Right on, right on. Now, indeed, Naomi sets out on a program of autonomy, as we read in text number 6. We just read, we're reading now text number 7. Now she arose with her daughters-in-law and returned from the fields of Moab, for she had heard in the field of Moab that the Lord had remembered his people to give them bread. Then she went forth from the place where she had been, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the road to return to the land of Judah. Just by Naomi doing that, she's making a decision to stay alive, to return, and so to speak, becomes the head of the household. Now, we have to keep in mind that this was in a time when women didn't act that way usually. If any of us are saying, is it such a big deal? Yes, certainly at that time. Now, we go on now to see that Ruth was equally autonomous, determined, and Naomi said, return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they should be your husbands? Return, my daughters, go, for I have become too old to marry, that I should say that I have hope. Even if I had a husband tonight, and even if I had born sons, would you wait for them until they grew up? Would you shut yourselves off for them and not marry? No, my daughters, for it is much more bitter for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. And they raised their voices and wept again. And then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth cleaved to her. And she said, lo, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and to her God. Return after your sister-in-law. And Ruth said, do not entreat me to leave you, to return from following you, for wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. So may the Lord do to me, and so may he continue, if anything but death separate me and you. And she saw that she was determined to go with her, so she stopped speaking to her. So what more do we learn about these three women? Naomi, what have we learned about her? I said it. You tell me, what do we learn about Orpah?
Well, she decided to go home.
So we know that she decided to go home, but what would we say about that decision?
He doesn't have a commitment to Ruth. And, you know, she prefers to be with her own family.
And is there anything wrong with that?
I
No.
don't think so. But
No, absolutely not. She doesn't have. Go ahead.
She's probably the more practical of the two.
Exactly.
but
There
what I
is nothing wrong with what Orpah does. It's that Ruth does the exceptional thing.
Yeah.
And that's important to remember.
Well, Ruth gives her the permission to go. I mean, not Ruth.
Well, no, but Naomi was also giving Ruth permission to go.
Yeah.
And Orpah was, as Marlene said, practical. And there was nothing wrong with that. She wasn't breaking a law by doing that. And there wasn't anything even from really menschlichkeit. I mean, how many daughters-in-law would follow their mother-in-law? Okay, we won't go there.
What I learned about Naomi is personal responsibility.
Well, Naomi is not responsible for Orpah anymore.
Takes
And
responsibility for herself.
She has responsibility to herself.
Yeah.
And Ruth, we're going to see that it's not just autonomy and being an advocate of taking initiative, but we're going to see the other reason also is kindness, why we have to read that with the book of law.
But
That
there is
following the law isn't enough, so that Ruth, we're going to see, what do we learn about Ruth from this? Aside, somebody already said, I think, Bev, that she is totally committed to Naomi.
But I think something as Chazal point out, that Ruth, like Mount Sinai, is an example of humility. A humbleness. Like
Well,
when Boaz noticed her because of her humility.
yes, I tend to use the word not humility, but I guess in order to be able to do this, I guess you do have to have humility, because she not only
It's her manner.
acts, she not only acts without any regard for self-interest, she sometimes, in fact, disregards her self-interest. And we'll get into that in a couple of moments.
Chazal said that Boaz noticed her by the way she picked up the wheat. She didn't just bend down, but in a very humble and modest way.
Yes.
And that's what caught his eye.
Yeah. And it's important, usually biblical heroines, we see a description of their external appearance. We do not have that at all with Ruth. Okay, now, I'm sure you've heard of Aviva Zornberg, the biblical teacher, and she says that Ruth really confronts law. Now, what does she mean by that? Remember, that Ruth comes from Moab. And if you recall, in the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy, we are told, an Ammonite or a Moabite shall not come into the assembly of the Eternal, into Israel, even to their 10th generation shall they not enter, because they met you not with bread or water in the way when you came forth from Egypt. So what Zornberg points out, Ruth was aware of this, and she knew she was a foreigner, but she was still willing because of her commitment, because there can be no other rational reason for her to go with Naomi. She's not going to get anything from Naomi anymore. She's going to go to a strange land where she's really not supposed to go. But she does that. She takes her chances, all because she is so devoted to Naomi. Now, they're on their way. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the fields of Moab, and they came to Beit Lechem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, what kind of a reception do you think awaits them?
There might be some people who are not too happy with them because
Why?
they left
reasons.
when there was the famine.
Exactly. First, it was her family was a traitor. Now they could say, well, she was not the head of the household and she just went along with Elimelech, but that definitely is true. They resent that they left them. What is another reason, which I've just basically given you?
It comes with a daughter-in-law who is not
Because
Jewish.
she's coming with a Moabite. Now, between you and me, the rule is really a male Moabite or Ammonite, but it was okay to bring in a Moabitess. But there were mixed feelings about it. So it's still a courageous and perhaps even dangerous act to do. Okay, so now what happens? Now Naomi had a kinsman because they're coming back. She's broke. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a mighty man of valor of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, I will go now to the field and I will glean among the ears of grain after someone whom I will please. And she said, go, my daughter. And she went and she came and she gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her chance was to come to the field that belonged to Boaz by accident, who was of the family of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Beit Lechem. And now let's also pay attention to his character. And he said to the reapers, may the Lord be with you. And they said to him, the Lord bless you. And he's credited there, Boaz, that he would come regularly to visit his workers. Then Boaz said to his servant who stood over the reapers, to whom does this maiden belong? And the servant in charge of the reapers answered and said, she is a Moabite maiden who returned with Naomi from the fields of Moab. And she said, I will now glean and gather from among the sheaves after the reapers. And she came and stood even from the morning until now, except when she sat a little in the house. And Boaz says to Ruth, have you not heard, my daughter? Do not go to glean in another field, neither shall you go away from here, and here you shall stay with my maidens. He wants her to know, in general, these rules of letting poor come and collect in your fields was a wonderful aspect of the society then, and a law. But he tells her, you are to stay here. Your eyes shall be on the field that they reap, and you shall follow them. Have I not ordered the youths not to touch you? And if you are thirsty, you may go to the vessels and drink from that which the youths draw. And she fell on her face and prostrated herself to the ground. And she said to him, why have I pleased you that you should take cognizance of me, seeing that I am a foreigner? She knows the situation. and he knows the situation. And what does Boaz say? He replies and said to her, "It has been told to me all that you did for your mother-in-law after your husband's death, and you left your father and mother and your native land, and you went to a people that you did not know before." Notice the parallel between her, who becomes a convert, and Avraham, who you could say was the first. May the Lord reward your deeds, and may your reward be full from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take shelter. And let me just repeat, not only is she like Avram in that way, that she leaves her home, but she, unlike Sinai, is choosing all of this out of her own free will. And she said, "Let me find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and you have spoken to the heart of your handmaid, but I am not as worthy as one of your handmaids." And Boaz said to her at mealtime, "Come here and partake of the bread and dip your morsel in the vinegar." So she sat down beside the reapers, and he handed her parched grain, and she ate and was salted and left over. And she rose to glean, and Boaz ordered his servants, saying, "Let her glean also among the sheaves, and do not embarrass her, and also pretend to forget some of the bundles for her," that's called shichacha, intentionally, "and leave it that she may glean, and do not scold her." And she gleaned in the field until evening, and she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was an ephah of barley. What sense do we have of this Boaz?
Generous.
Generous. And why is he referred to as exceptional also, like Ruth? At first,
The way
if
she
we were to read every pasuk, we would see that unlike Naomi and Ruth, he didn't necessarily initiate. He could have gone to Naomi as soon as they got to town, but he learns to react and to respond. He certainly shows love by nurturing, giving the food, and personally preparing, like Abraham. And what other detail is important here?
He shows responsibility to the family.
He's showing responsibility to the family, and he's not letting what bother him?
The fact that she's not Jewish.
The fact that she's a Moabite. Okay. Now,
he's also concerned about her safety.
very important, Sarah, very important. And we're going to get to that in a moment. She also is aware of when she goes to the threshing floor that she might be in danger, not so much physical danger, but yes, we see how he's warning his reapers to make sure she's okay, but she realizes that her reputation might be at stake. We'll get to that in a moment. There's
also sensitivity that he's not giving her charity. He tells them to drop it so that she can pick it up.
Yes, okay, the fact, right, considering her sensitivities. And now she goes back to Naomi, and Naomi again goes into action mode. And Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek rest for you, that it be good for you? And now is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maidens you were? Behold, he is winnowing the threshing floor of the barley tonight." Without going into detail, we know of the tradition that if there's a widow, and if there is a member of the family who can marry her to keep the heritage along and the legacy alive, aside from caring for financially, being able to buy the land and marry, that was a tradition then. Okay, so Naomi is already thinking that Boaz could be the right one for the job. And now is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maidens you were? Behold, he is winnowing the threshing floor of the barley tonight, and you shall bathe. Now, I want you to pay close attention to what Naomi is going to say and what Ruth actually does. So in verse 3 here, and you shall bathe and anoint yourself and put on your clothes and go down to the threshing floor. Do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And it shall be when he lies down, and you shall know where he will lie, and you shall come and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what you shall do. And she said to her, all that you say to me, I will do. Another sign of her total devotion to her. And she went down to the threshing floor, and she did all that her mother-in-law had charged her. Do you see a difference? Naomi had told her to change first. She first go to the threshing floor, and then she changes. Getting back to what Sarah said, she is concerned, but it doesn't stop her that people could see her and think of her as a harlot. She's willing to risk it. And there can't be anything that she's looking to gain for herself throughout this, because she didn't have to come. She could go elsewhere. She's not committed to this family. And Boaz ate and drank, and his heart was merry, and he went to lie at the edge of the stack. And she came softly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. And it came to pass at midnight, and the man quaked and was taken around, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. And he said, who are you? And she said, I am Ruth, your handmaid, and you shall spread your skirt over your handmaid, for you are a near kinsman. That's a euphemism for something. And he said, may you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. Your latest act of kindness is greater than the first, not to follow the young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. All that you shall say, I will do for you, for the entire gate of my people know that you are a valiant woman. And now, indeed, I am a near kinsman, but there is a kinsman closer than I. And so Boaz wants to do the right thing, says, stay over tonight, and it will come to pass in the morning that if he redeem you, well, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, I will, as the Lord lives, lie down until morning. And she lay at his feet until morning, and she rose before one could recognize his fellow, for he said, let it not be known that the woman came to this threshing floor. As Sarah said, again, he's looking out for her. And he said, ready the shawl you are wearing and hold it. And she held it, and he measured out 6 barleys and placed upon her, and he came to the city. Now, what does Boaz do? He does go to the gate where a lot of activity would happen and cases were solved, etc., etc. People met there, and he said to the near kinsman, Naomi, who has returned from the field of Moab, is selling the portion of the field that belonged to our brother, to Elimelech. And I said, I will let you know, saying, buy it in the presence of those who sit here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem, redeem. And if he will not redeem, tell me, and I will know. For there is no one besides you to redeem, and I am after you. And he said, I will redeem. And Boaz then says, on the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi and from Ruth, the Moabitess, the wife of the deceased, you have bought it to preserve the name of the deceased on his heritage. And the near kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar my heritage. You redeem my redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Unlike Boaz, this other redeemer, once it comes to marrying her, no. That doesn't sit well with him because she is a Moabitess. Now, Boaz is the exception, and he's willing to do this. Now, let's look at Ruth's impact, her kindness. And again, I tell you that reading Megillat Ruth, where the stress is on Gemilut Chesed, not just Gemilut Chesed, act of kindness, but going beyond the letter of the law, doing what you don't have to do, she has an impact. And this is fascinating, that it comes from Ruth, which might explain why she is the ancestor of David. And also Ruth the Moabitess, Machlon's wife, have I acquired for myself for a wife, Boaz says, to preserve the name of the deceased on his heritage, so that the name of the deceased not be obliterated from his brethren and from the gate of his place. You are witnesses today. Now watch how the people react very differently from when they first came back to Beit Lechem. And all the people who were in the gate and the elders replied, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is entering your house like Rachel and like Leah, both of whom built up the house of Israel, and prosper in Ephrata and be famous in Beit Lechem. And may your house be like the house of Peretz from Tamar, bore to Judah with the seed that the Lord will give you from this maiden. They're encouraging. And Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he was intimate with her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And the women who at first said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord, who did not deprive you of a redeemer today, and may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and to sustain your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you bore him, and she is better to you than 7 sons. So it took Ruth, with her quality of chesed, to impact these people who were following the letter of the law to begin with about a Moabite, and who also resented. Ruth did nothing for herself, though hopefully she'll be happy with Boaz for at least a few years. He's an old guy, and I don't want to hear somebody say that's really why he did it. Don't dare destroy this, because he wanted to be with somebody younger. But Torah is history, but it is a book of laws. And to balance the giving of the laws, Megillat Ruth tells us that, as we've said before, we need to combine that with thinking, being autonomous, looking at the moment. And these people came to realize, look at this Ruth. She's saving the family of Naomi. How can we hold something against her? So they looked at that moment. And just to close with 2 thoughts about this connection. So Aviva Zornberg says the following: every commendable act in the book goes beyond the law. Those who only follow the law, like Orpah and Ploni Almoni. Ploni Almoni was the name of the other redeemer, but it's not a name. It's just like a John Doe, which is significant. You know, they did the regular, routine, acceptable thing. They lose their place in the narrative, even though they are not evil people at all, just ordinary. Rabbi Zera says, this Megillah has nothing of purity and impurity, of forbidden and permitted. So why is it written if it has no legal significance? To teach you how great the reward for doing acts of emet v'chesed. The highest value is lifnim mishurat hadin, beyond the letter of the law, chesed. And to conclude, again with Rabbi Dotan, why is Ruth so determined? Why does she choose to remain specifically with Naomi? Here lies the unstated reason for reading the book of Ruth on Shavuot. The rabbis who attached Megillat Ruth to the festival of our receiving the Torah attempted, in their unique fashion, to imply something about our relationship with God. You must, Rabbi Dotan urges, conquer the overwhelming desire to be at Sinai above all else. You don't want to go back. You were already there. Now you must progress onward until you reach the level of Ruth and Naomi, where the gap between the sides no longer exists. Like Ruth, you have a choice. We have that choice. You can turn your back on God and man, and you can seek a comfortable life. precisely here where God and man seem to have nothing to offer you, and you may expect nothing from them, because Ruth did not do this out of expectation for anything. If you succeed at the stage of Ruth and Naomi and face God and your fellow man without expectations or demanding something in return, then you will understand the meaning of belief.
יפה.
Well said.
So I would add, it's a pity that this holiday isn't attended to as much as it should. But as I've said, I think 2 weeks ago, Shavuot, or the receiving of the Torah, should be a daily occurrence. So I hope that as we celebrate Shavuot, 1 day here and 2 days where you are, let's celebrate thinking about Torah as Torat Chaim, a living Torah, and let us once again choose to renew our brit, our covenant with God. And if anyone forgot, Stephen is looking for a recipe for a cheesecake without sugar. So if you haven't done that, you have a moment to put that into the chat. If anybody would like to share a thought.
By the way, cheese reminds me of the milk dairy that we eat on Shavuot, which comes from the expression Chadasha L'Hashem Ba'avotechem.
Bracha, what does it take to move people who follow the law? I would call them technologists. They do it to get it done. Motivate their hearts so that they go beyond the letter of the law. I think what you're speaking about is goodness for goodness sake, without looking for a reward. How can people be moved to the level of Ruth? Any suggestions?
No, it's either in you or it's not. It comes from deep, deep in your soul.
But it's also upbringing. By example.
Sarah, do you agree with that it's also upbringing?
A little bit, yes, but it's much more than that. It's even before you were born.
Bracha,
Well, I'd
does
like
this
to
in any
believe
way-
that we all, with children, we do have a part to play, and that they eventually learn the part they have to play.
Yeah, but
Some do, but some don't.
yeah, but it's also training. Like I remember as a child, there were boxes, there was Kan Kayemet and there were the others. And every Friday, each child had to put something in. We were not told how much, but each child had to put something into the box. So you get trained to make a donation to do chesed.
Well,
Bracha,
somebody
in
said
any
that
way-
earlier, that sometimes by doing something, it's a combination. It's a combination. Now, talking about education, unfortunately, we will not meet next week because we are celebrating the graduation of my niece, Liana, from grade 12 high school.
Wow.
And of course,
Mazel tov.
Mazel tov, mazel tov.
That's a nice
Mazel
occasion.
tov, Nachama.
Yeah.
So we'll meet again on a different topic on June 15th.
May I ask which school she's graduating from?
Nachama,
Zeligsburg.
Zeligsburg.
Okay.
Okay.
Bracha, I have a question. Does this level of heart or whatever that leads one to go beyond the letter of the law, can that in any way be related to what was described somewhere in the holy text as circumcision of the heart? Circumcision of the heart.
I don't know. Already half the heart is the Yetzer Hara, the evil instinct. So I think if we cut away any more, it will be a hard act to be able to go beyond the letter of the law.
I'm just thinking we just have to keep encouraging, minor acts of kindness. Continue with the acts of kindness wherever you have the opportunity.
Amen.
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 Bracha.
Dan.
I was just thinking earlier in your remarks and referring to this autonomous car and Shabbat. This deserves a session of discussion.
Okay, we'll do. Okay.
It involves a lot of stuff.
Yes, it does.
We have a Shabbat elevator in shul.
Yeah. It's all about it. Okay. I want to wish everybody a Chag Sameach, a Shabbat Shalom, and enjoy your warm weather followed by rainstorms.
Yasher Kola Kavod.
Okay.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.